and the fact that Elon's calling them terrorists.
Today I'm thrilled to introduce Dr. Chris Smedley, the Canadian futurist and entrepreneur who spent over 40 years pushing the boundaries of compute technology. Join us as Dr. Smedley shares how he experienced the 2025 Tesla Shareholder Meeting on November 6, how the future sustainable abundance that we have been talking about in this show quite a few times will possibly look like, and why he says that the singularity isn't coming, but that it's already knocking on our doors. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Ideal Investor Show. As you guys know, we always bring you interesting guests with interesting opinions, and today is not different, and this has been quite a while in the making. So Chris Smedley, welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for being persistent.
Yeah, well, I know that you are very busy and famous man and have lots of great connections and stuff. So I'm very proud and honored that you make it to the show. So it's annual shareholder meeting at Tesla. So you want to start there, or you want to start bigger picture first?
No, I think that's a great place to go. What were your initial thoughts on the event and, general retail sentiment, perhaps?
I felt more and more calm about all those board of directors suggestions, and that they would probably be passed the way the board had suggested, including the pay package for Elon, or both if you want. My focus gets sharper on how the broader public is constantly being manipulated, right? You basically did not see any announcement of all the people, whether they're retail or institutional, who said, I'm for what the board suggested. You pretty much only saw any individual opportunity to show that somebody is against it. I don't know. Do you have an opinion about that?
Yeah, it gives us market advantage. So, there's this fundamental assumption about the wisdom of the markets and
Yeah.
that things are fairly priced in and so on and so forth. But as many of the content creators in the retail space as well have been lamenting for a very long time, there's a disconnect between the institutional analysts on both the buy and the sell side, right? Because, most people don't realize that at institutions there's a Chinese wall because, Goldman can say, we're going to give a $600 price target that is disconnected from people giving advice to their own clients, and those two groups are supposed to be separated because their motivations are different, right? And
Yeah.
so, when you look at what is the confluence of media and institutional investors, Wall Street per se, and you realize that they are disconnected, they are actually being propagandized to, they are incentivized, and more importantly, they're incentivized in many ways to say, here's the narrative that I need to tell people. So you generally get a few folks like Dan Ives and, a few others who are notable because they stick their head above, and sometimes they get it whacked off. I was also listening to content creators, a retail guy who's going like, they got 1%, who cares? And that the Norwegian fund is politicians. They don't own the stock, they don't have interest in the stock. So in that respect, it's very much like ISIS and as Stephen Mark Ryan says, ask Lewis, right? And the fact and the fact that Elon's calling them terrorists.
Yeah,
And
I hear.
so there are agents who voted no in this case for ideological or political reasons. And when you look at the Norwegians, it's quite clear they're like, well, we're just trying to flex this political idea that, you can't be too rich in Norway because we'll take your stuff away, which is consistent with the wealth tax that they have. So, they are voting members of, the public, the Norwegian public. So
Right. Yeah.
their answers are going to be political, one way or the other.
Yeah, I hear
You
you.
know,
I mean, I meant it more a little broader. If somebody is not that deep in, like you and I are in it, but they kind of keep an eye on financial news or what's going on in the markets and stuff, and they see every individual mention of some fund that they have probably no clue about that voted against, but nobody said, like Ron Barron, for example, was for it or whatever. My other point in this context is a little bit that there is this narrative shaping that seems to be going on all the time. And I posted it on X and other places as often as I could. I personally believe if the concept is correct, that the board of directors is basically the representatives of the shareholder in between meetings. And they make recommendations, and you as a owner of shares do not agree with their recommendations. In my opinion, if you vote against, then you should also sell the shares.
maybe, but for the purpose of you know, retail investors and Tesla advocates like ourselves, the point that I said earlier is this gives us alpha, to use Joe's terms,
Right. Yeah,
right?
totally. Yeah.
Is that we can apply intelligence, we can apply AGI, we can apply, that we're having these conversations and that we're more aware than, a broker at random organization X who's got
Right.
grandma on the phone going, oh, what should I tell people about Tesla? And when you realize that if you're looking at as again, as Stephen Mark Ryan says, CNBS, you know, and they're having somebody on, there's a narrative there that the average viewer, widows and orphans, if you will, are unable to understand that this is entirely false narrative and that it's being manipulated for whatever reasons. And the difference between this is from a trading perspective, we get to take grandma's money. We get to take the innocent, uninformed person who listens to the propaganda, succumbs to the bad information, bets against Elon, and we take the longer term strategic view and say, well, whenever the market provides an opportunity to take their money, because remember, there's always a winner and a loser on the trade, right? So we want to get higher alpha, we want to be the winners, which means that our only obligation is to be ethical in how we, you know, take the money from their accounts.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I look at a little more neutral as buyers and sellers, but you're absolutely right. That's kind of like where the price comes from in the end. Now, when we're going back to the actual meeting and the announcements that were made, what would you say was the most surprising or the most important one, or maybe one of each?
I think the mention that they're going to be building a 1 million run rate robot factory by the end of 26, and then a 10 million in Texas, like the 1 million's in Fremont, the 10 million is going to be in Austin. And then he says, I don't know where the 100 million would be, right? That in particular, well, he says maybe on Mars, right? Well, it, it but here's the point. I have access to previous scaling conversations. And if you basically say, okay, they're committing to build the capacity for 1 million in 26, then they're going 10x for 27. I'm proposing they'll go 5x for 28, so on and so forth. And by the time you get to 31, you have 1 billion a year run rate. So, he's had many conversations about this. And if you basically just generally try and 10x, and I'm saying put a 5x break in there,
Right.
if that's the primary goal, that by the time you get into the mid 2030s, you'll be building 1 billion a year, you'll have a population of around 10 billion, so on and so forth. So that's basically saying they're already committing capital over the next 2 fiscal years to build a capacity to generate 10 million robots on this design. So that is probably the largest single element that I took away from that.
Hey, let's take a quick break for a message from our sponsors.
Semi-passive franchising is probably, in my opinion, the #1 methodology for building wealth and equity, because more and more of these service brands are introducing these semi-passive models, now opening up this opportunity to franchise investors and virtually everyone.
And Franchise with Bob can actually help you to make that happen and go into an existing system and plug right in and start developing your passive income. So go to Franchise with Bob, find the quiz on the homepage, and see how franchising might be the right thing for you.
The second one that, from a transhumanist perspective, was buried in one of the Q&As. And that was a conversation where a fellow said, do you think we'll be able to basically upload human intelligence or human consciousness
Right.
into an Android? And I'm like, hey, I'm there, and he's like, through Neuralink, less than 20 years. I was actually a speaker at an event that a Russian billionaire put on in 2014 called GF 2045, where we talked about neuroprosthetics and ultimately the merger of brains and synthetic machines and all of this. And the target for exactly what we just discussed was 2045. So, that's the ultimate in immortality. And if you also tie this into the robot conversation, is, there's probably not going to be a lot of human life on Mars, but the spark of human consciousness is going to go in the form of our robots, certainly in the beginnings, So most people also haven't factored in that SpaceX will be a customer of Tesla in terms of buying, these early models, even if it's only to ship them to Mars and watch them die, right? Like
I mean,
stress
they're doing
testing.
this. Yeah, they're doing this with Cybertruck right now. I mean, I don't know. Some people had like a weird reaction. If anybody has ever spent a little bit of time, and I'm a little bit of a freak from my aviation background. I've grown up when the first moon rockets started and failed and stuff, all the way to Armstrong on the moon and stuff. And I was little and fascinated. Um, I was surprised when people said, okay, all these diesel trucks that are currently used around Starbase, why this place is massively growing, quickly growing, will be replaced by Cybertruck. I mean, obviously there is a connection because of the stainless steel, but there's also a connection to sustainability and so forth. So to me, that makes total sense. And the same thing, when you say, okay, before we send humans, we send robots to Mars, that makes sense to me as well. So yeah, absolutely. SpaceX being a customer makes a lot of sense. Now, one thing with a lot of people, I know that you're probably listening and watching similar people that I'm following. They speak in the context of Tesla, and rightfully so, about the total addressable market for each one of these different products. And I'm really curious, Chris, you just mentioned potentially 8 to 10 billion people out there by the time this is all getting to full scale production. How do you see the likelihood that this is really going to be the addressable market?
There's a bit of a disconnect here, because the people that argue for uh, capitalist economics and valuations and total addressable markets and profit share also don't understand what it means when Elon says robots are an infinite money glitch. And by that, what he means is that robot economics are so much more productive than humans, both on cognitive tasks and in embodied physical
Yeah,
work,
totally. Yeah.
that we understand it's going to cause mass unemployment. But on the other side of it, the entire notion of GDP becomes abstracted as you move towards abundance. So, there becomes a period where money is ultra important. We're in that phase. So let's say that, if we take our projections out to 2030, 2031, or, consistent with around the end of the US term, then that's a long enough period where some of these TAM discussions are relevant. And so if I were to pin down how many vehicles are they looking at, there was conversations about how he's going to get to 5 million vehicles a year by yada, yada, yada. We could spreadsheet all of that and include in that, by 2030, you might be looking at between 100 and 500 million robots per year. And then upstream of that, where the supply constraints, the AI chips, right, to put into these, there's probably going to be 2 chips in every robot and every
Yeah.
vehicle as there
Yeah.
is now. Just from a
Yes.
pure redundancy, there may in fact be a lot more when you realize that ultimately Elon's looking at using the chips as distributed AI. So, remember the conversation you had about how with AI 6, the inference and training are going to be the same. The difference being is that you might have one AI 6 chip to do inference, but that maybe there'd be 512 that would be like the dojo equivalent, right?
Yeah, I hear that, although I have to say the only context that I've heard that and it makes sense to me is in cars, because even if you imagine all cars being robotaxis, there will still be times where if you have a normal distribution that caters to all the people that might want it during the day, I mean, I don't think that we will get to a point where people would have the same utilization day, night, 24/7, right? So for me, it makes total sense to say, and it really not so much whether it's one chip or multiple chips in a car, but it makes total sense to say, even in a robotaxi environment, you probably have 8 hours or so per day on average, and maybe a little bit more on weekends where the cars are just not utilized and you can basically use them to run basically a huge inference data center. I get that part. I'm not so sure I get that with robots because I'm always thinking both in manufacturing as well as in household use. Well, maybe not 23 hours, but more than what you would potentially use a car for, then when you have the robot. What I'm getting at and why I asked you the question is a little bit more in the direction. And I don't know if you followed it, but if I recall it correctly, initially when it came to Chinese electric vehicles, the reaction in the US was, well, let's put 100% tariffs on it because they're cheating with their subsidies. And then when it looked like a couple of the brands might have made the calculation to say, okay, if we can make it for 20 and it costs basically 39 or 40 with the tariffs, we could still probably make 5 or 6,000 on every car if we sell it for like 45 or 47, knowing that the average car in the US right now, brand new car, is almost $50,000. When that came out, at least in my recollection, it was, well, it's not just the tariff, but we also need to be worried about national security. What do you think about that?
Well, I think, in the Western world, this is also true in Canada. They have 100% tariff on Chinese EVs,
Yeah.
as they have a 25% tariff on Tesla vehicles for blatantly stated ideological and political reasons. Like Donald Trump told me to do it, we're doing it. Or in
Right,
the case of Canada, it's, was literally to help win an election and Elon bad.
right,
So, you don't read too much into that, except it's politicians politicking, right? And it's a headwind, but if you sort of go to the second order conversation, which is what is the global competitive landscape of Chinese vehicles vis-a-vis Tesla? And keeping this in context with the AGM, there's, if we're looking at having the cyber cab coming out, April was when it's going to start scaling up next year. That was announced, wonderful. And he's giving you a conversation about cycle times, getting them below 10 seconds, potentially getting a 5 million unit per per line kind of thing.
right.
And this is all that really matters, is that that's the gigafactory, the product, the machine that makes the machines. And that's going to use Wright's law to drive the price down. So ultimately, Tesla will be building the same high quality FSD capable automobile, right? With the data side, and they're going to be competing against companies like BYD, who apparently might go bankrupt momentarily, as is likely the case for almost all existing legacy auto. There's many that are on the chopping block right now.
Yeah.
So if we go forward, even the next 5 years, and you say the nature of automobiles is going to radically shift from private auto sales, as Tony Seba has said all along, to this rental model, and that the faster and more vehicles that Tesla can put on the road, whether those are, I believe that there's going to be a sales to fleets and third parties and all of this stuff
Right.
because it
Right.
just helps keep cash on the balance sheet. But, there's nothing that's preventing them from getting to the point where, as Elon said, there's 100 million of them on the road. And circling that back just to a close on that earlier comment about distributed AI, the point there that Elon even said in yesterday's presentation was, well, maybe the AI 5 chip is too smart for driving.
I get
Maybe it's
bored.
only, he says, maybe it's only 10% and it gets bored. So we'll give it the other 90% of its brain, something that humans can't do, a whole bunch of extra work to do. So, we simplified the conversation with our limited human mind by going, well, you can either drive the car or you can, and that you have to be stationary in the garage in order to be used as that's a human bias
Yeah, absolutely.
that,
Although I'm
that we
still
can be
not sure if it,
absolutely
yeah.
concurrent. And
Yeah,
as
yeah.
the technology improves, like how much AI does it take to drive at a red light? you know so that's the point, is there will be variable, just like with human drivers, there's a variable amount of intelligence that needs to be applied to the driving that's situationally dependent, right? And
Yeah,
the
absolutely. I mean,
rest of it,
yeah,
is available for everything else.
yeah. On the one hand, I'm with you, right? From what was mentioned in the meeting, there are a couple of different ways to look at it, in my opinion, right? If there were a case where you say there is a circumstance in driving where you absolutely need to have 100% of the capacity, let's say, of an AI 6 chip, then it makes sense to me to say, okay, we are designing the chip and its capabilities for that worst case scenario. And that's why we're putting it in the car. And that worst case scenario is what, like 1 in 1 million miles or something like that. And most of the other time.
Respectfully, I think you're kind of not looking at it the same way. Is if we assert that autonomy is solved with FSD 14 this year, first
Right.
assumption, and on hardware 4, that means that the supposed 40x under some circumstances improvement between AI 4 and AI 5 means that there's potentially 40 times more processing power than is actually required by an existing hardware 4 vehicle. So anything that model could handle, any contingencies, and the March of Nines and all that kind of stuff, that's already a known piece of hardware. So, that's exactly the point, that Elon's talking about 10%. But if you assume that means that AI 5 is, let's say, 10x or 8x more powerful, then that means that your earlier assertion about, well, what are the most power demanding conditions? We already know it. It's within the power envelope and the AI 4 processing chip. And the
Right,
question
right.
is,
Yeah.
like with
I
the
mean,
light,
I'm with you. Yeah, I'm with you on this, Chris. What I'm getting at is the one thing is obviously the fascination with the technology, right? But on the other hand, I would have to say, okay, we have AI 4. It's basically capable to do the autonomous driving. There are, like Elon said himself yesterday, there are a few things, a few mistakes we made, few circumstances that we could do better. We will solve those with AI 5. Totally with you. On the other hand, you would say from a purely, like how do I build an efficient product for the purposes that I'm building it, I'm not necessarily seeing, other than the data center usage or that the chip gets bored or whatever, why do you then need to have 6 and 7 and 8 if you're pretty sure that all the circumstances you can imagine will be easily handled by 5, right? So I'm only looking at it from that perspective, or because, I mean, I have looked a little bit because, maybe I'm a little bit of a freak or stuff. I wanted to see what is the struggle with the Samsung factory in Texas. And the struggle is basically that they originally said, we're building a 4 nanometer chip, and then we evolved to build a 2 nanometer chip. And when
Yeah, and it
TSMC
went to like
already,
50 billion, right?
yeah, but I think the point was more,
Anastasia in Tex has a great
yeah,
video on
exactly.
that
I
about the
watched her thing.
$50 billion fab.
Yeah, I thought it was massively biased. I really didn't like the video, the way she positioned it, but the information is always very good. And so this decision to say, okay, we're probably not going to compete on 4 nanometers with TSMC when they're already shipping it and we haven't even built the factory yet. So we're going one step lower to 2 nanometers. That I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole, but part of it is also to say, okay, if that means, for example, AI6 and AI7 would have that technology, do you really need it to operate an autonomous car? And if you purely
Well,
look at how,
that's the wrong question. That's where, if I can, just sorry for interrupting. You know, the question isn't how much smarts do I need to have an autonomous car? We know that it's 500 tops times 2 processors, AI hardware 4. We're done. Question answered, right? Now, the next product is Optimus. And you
right?
have Brett Winton just discussing that it could be up to 1 million times more processing. Now, I think that's ridiculous. But when you look at Optimus and the use cases and the varied number of skill sets that ultimately will be AGI and ASI level skills, right? Ultimately, this thing's going to walk around with a 300 IQ and be able to do backflips on
Yeah,
Tuesday.
totally.
Right. But basically, that is where the infinite thirst is for more AI, more intelligence. And the idea is ultimately you're trying to create this infinite cycle of energy, AI, training begats more. And the process that we're going through, and this ties into a conversation that I'll be having more in depth later, is the sun catcher and star cloud, and now Elon's talking about AI8 will be out of this world, and this is something I'm working on called orbital assets, and one of them is the data centers, right? So as
Right.
people
Yeah.
talk about going data centers in space, it's, in my mind, how do we build a polar ring that is orbital intelligence, like think Dyson sphere, all that kind of stuff. So you take the Suncatcher model and you just say, wrap the entire planet with as much intelligence as we can build. And then you have energy there, you go down the Dyson sphere, all of this kind of stuff. So and it's all driven from Starship. So that's a plan that I haven't quite I was inspired with what Elon was talking about. I don't know if he's got ideas on how to deploy it, but it's an interesting exercise to say, how do we use Starship not just to launch, Starlink, but to put the data center, build it all in, you know, and my argument is to make them like one entire data center per Starship payload, like 100 tons, pack it in, out you go. And then connect it with lasers and,
Right, yeah, exactly. I mean, that's a little bit of a different discussion I would love to have. Maybe we should have a second show because that goes into this whole idea, what is latency requirement, right? Like if you say, okay, just for the sake of argument, I think I've seen something, I don't know if it was Tesla related or SpaceX related, where somebody said, okay, and I don't know if it was Elon or some other scientist who said it's actually a really good location from a cooling perspective and stuff like that to put it in a shaded crater on the dark side of Moon. And then you obviously need some relay, to get around basically the moon and back to Earth. And how much that is with a laser to get to, like, I don't know, maybe something like a Starlink 4 to transmit from there that, get back down to the ground. I have no idea. I've not seen anybody done the calculation.
I'm not well, I have some of that information, but I'm not sure if we're asking the same thing.
Well, the
So,
thing is, I mean, if you say AI-8 would be basically orbital AI,
well, I'm
right?
I'm actually saying this. The model that I'm working on right now is how could we use Starship to put AI 5 chips up,
Yeah, right. Well, we could
right?
basically do it with Starlink, right? You
Right.
could,
And that's exactly the point, is that, when you look at building these clusters right now, NVIDIA uses NVLink, and, there's
yeah,
the interesting thing that I took from the Suncatcher is they actually put up a cluster of satellites with what they call free optical links, free space optical links, aka space lasers, aka exactly what Starlink has today, which is a
right,
1.66 terabyte per link optical connection, which they can point at things,
right.
right?
And relatively
So,
small
so
things, actually.
right. So if I'm basically saying you'd equip your Starship with multiple pointable Starship links, each doing 1.6 terabits per second, and that on the back end, each one of those maps out to one or more chips, depending how you multiplex it. You basically take an NV link and made it optical in free space so that any cluster of satellites could communicate directly to any node that they want and keep all of the destination data coherent. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. Although I think you could just make the satellites, the appropriate size and use Starship just for the transport.
Well, this is where we get into a second sort of conversation. I'm trying to assert that all Starship payloads should be done like Falcon is, which is that the entire payload section, the like blow off the fairing, release the payload stage as a separate stage, which is a complete 9-meter diameter
Yeah, I
functioning
get
satellite.
you. Yeah, I think this is coming. I believe right now there is a little bit of a restriction by just what SpaceX has signed up for, right? I mean, they signed up for the tanker version, they have signed up for the HLS version, they've signed up for a version that can basically pass dispenser out Starlink 3 and 4 versions and stuff. But I'm with you. I think, especially in light of the fact that we're basically still in the prototype stage, that full capacity space of the payload, if you were to look at, just fairings in the sense like Falcon 9, could ultimately hold something. I mean, in a way, I don't know if people realize that so-called payload section is basically equivalent to the innards of a 747 airplane, right? Like, so if you want to be a little bit adventurous, you could say the payload section of a Starship is basically a space station in and of itself, right? It
Well,
has almost,
that's exactly what I'm proposing, and that, we move to a model where these can be joined together, they can be
yeah,
docked
yeah, yeah,
together.
yeah.
Like, they've got RCS thrusters, they've got everything they need. And basically, it's if we go back to Apollo, it's like, well, here is the spacecraft, which happens to be an energy satellite or a data center or a
Yeah,
habitat,
absolutely.
or
Yeah.
and partly what I'm looking at is, if we were to put proper latching mechanisms on each end and proper docking, is you could put them together in a line, you could put them together into rings, you could do rotations, all that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, I mean, they
Artificial
were,
gravity,
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I'm with you,
but
Chris.
at the same time, they also operate as free floating devices. And as we said before, every one of them would be communicating through this optical space link that they're already using, which is where SpaceX has the advantage of, well, we're already using this tech in Starlink. So it's just, why would you not equip every one of these spacecraft with that? And then the AI gets to use that very high bandwidth.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I believe very strongly that they're going to do this anyway to actually prove the refueling capability. And if you can prove it that you can do that, not just for the fluid transfer, but just for the docking, of an object of that size. Because in a way, what's happening right now is you have like a 747 docking with a tiny little Dragon, right? But when you have two 747s or more, it gets a little bit more tricky, in my opinion. But when that has been proven in 2026, I don't think there's really a limit on how many you can potentially kind of Lego type click together and make something bigger out of it.
Well, on that point, I was looking at the HLS and the nose docking, which is the same as Dragon,
Yeah,
and thinking, let's say that you have these modules up there and they're supposed to be pressurized and, habitable kinds of space, then, exactly the same port configuration as the HLS makes the most sense, because
totally. Yeah.
then any HLS could dock with these modules on space.
Yeah, I think there will be probably, this is my vision for like maybe a few more years into the future, and also different from what is needed for Mars, is that you can basically make a starship that has barely any tanks or anything like that, just some maneuvering thrusters, and just be willing to say, okay, super heavy has to be disposable every once in a while just to get something to the appropriate orbital speed. But if you think about how much you would probably have, I'm guessing a 4-to-1 or 5-to-1 advantage, right? You lose one super heavy, but you have 4 times as much space if you just take the whole starship and not waste like 4/5 of it for tanks.
Yeah, well, my thoughts are that I'm proposing a few different designs, playing with some designs and concepts. And one of them is that we need to make what I'm calling a star shuttle,
Yeah,
which
exactly.
is,
Yeah,
the cabin section, the nose cones, all of that, and a much smaller propellant section, let's say half, right?
yeah,
And that this would be the third stage, and you basically have a
right.
ship. The propellant and propulsion section of the current starship would have its own third stage separation, like call it a hot staging ring, right?
Yeah,
So there's
yeah,
a
yeah,
full third stage craft, and that it's that smaller craft that would be, let's say, more like the command module and the lunar module, and that would handle 10, 15 people. It's a much more practical size to be able to do than the full starship with the propellant tanks. And particularly if you look at lunar deployment, and that you might want to have a bunch of these things. And I also look at these star shuttles for suborbital flights and for personal rockets. It's a much more affordable model, and you basically abstract everything else into booster sections. Like, that's the point of
yeah,
having a rocket, right? Like, I
yeah,
think
yeah,
we need a
exactly.
third
Yeah.
stage here. And you
Yeah,
would
I
have
think
a
it's
much
just,
smaller heat shield, all that stuff, right?
yeah, I mean, somebody will sit down and look at, is it cheaper to make a bigger booster and just let it go? Or is it cheaper to make it a three-stage vehicle where you have basically the first one
Right.
coming back?
Well, all I'm discussing is, just hypothetically speaking, if you can cut a saw on the propulsion section of the starship,
Yeah,
and then in there put its own propulsion, like three
right.
Raptors, whatever, with its own little engine, right? Then do you have a booster which is smaller than the Super Heavy, which could generally be used as a second stage general purpose booster? So, it's not a Super Heavy, it's a heavy booster.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that would be a fascinating discussion. I mean, for me, there are some issues about the whole goal of complete reusability would have to be looked at in a different way. And then the other thing is orbital velocity is something where you have to ask yourself, okay,
Why
in some
why is the reusability different? Because I'm thinking the second stage is also propellant landable, all that stuff.
right, but if you look at the last test flights, how hard it is to get something that ever got to orbital speed to be reusable or bring it back.
Well,
I'm
what was
not,
the challenge there was reentry mostly, right? We're at the point where the heat
yeah,
shield is
yeah, yeah, exactly.
almost solved. Right.
Yeah.
So
Well,
if we're using the three-stage approach and you've got two boosters that get recovered, right? Then you only need a heat shield on the dragon-sized capsule, if you will.
right, but my
Right?
my
Just the
thing,
nose
and
section.
yeah, I hear what you're saying, but for me, it's and maybe we should get off this because that becomes a rabbit hole. That middle
Yeah,
part,
maybe.
that middle part would have to get almost orbital velocity, and then somehow come back and not needing a heat shield. So to me, that is a little bit of a tricky thing because if the Starship component itself is not really having big tanks and big engines and all that kind of stuff, something needs to get it to orbital velocity, or almost
Well,
orbital.
that's the first and second stage.
Right, but when
So
you get like, if
even
you
think with a
say
starship right now, the front of the ship is moving at orbital velocity, right? The same speed as the tanks.
no, yeah, I'm
All I'm
with you.
saying
I
is
mean,
now flip the
if
tank,
you're
right?
saying basically take like an extended, bigger version of Dreamcatcher and plug it on top of the um of the
No,
Starship,
I'm
basically.
saying like the third stage of the Saturn V, where it's the second stage puts it at orbital velocity, and the third stage just does orbital insertion.
Yeah, yeah, right. But then the second stage needs to also be able to come back through the atmosphere at that speed.
Right. So now you get into whether or not the second stage needs to have its own heat shield, which
Right,
guess
right.
what? The ship already does. So if you just take the ship and you say it's going to separate into a third stage and the second stage booster with the tail wings, whatever, it comes back exactly as it does. Anyway, we don't have to go down the rabbit hole too
No, I
much
mean,
there because I can see,
especially since I think we have a few more years to observe how that's actually evolving. I want to go back to Optimus and to robots in general, because I think that was the biggest takeaway and also the biggest outlook. And I also want us to come a little bit towards the idea of how will this impact normal human beings and investors. Obviously, for the show, I'm more interested to talk about investors. So when you look at the market that is easily open without any kind of national security considerations or stuff like that. Where do you see that? What do you think would be like realistic numbers?
realistic numbers of what? Number of robots that we're going to see over
Yeah, that
time,
number. I
or
mean, we know that Elon said, we're going to do a million capacity, then 10 million capacity, 100 million capacity, where we don't know yet where we're going to make them. I can totally see this, and I can see this be easily used in all the what we currently call the Western countries. I always look at, would everybody want to have one? Yeah, I want at least one. And then I see all the industrial applications. So we have about 1 billion people in the West, plus there's plenty of industrial applications. So I could see more than 1 billion just in the Western world, so to speak, in the currently so-called Western world. But do you see the opportunity to get it beyond that?
I think maybe the wise thing to do is to keep our horizons um, like no further than the end of 28. So, we've gotten a
Okay.
roadmap here for 26,
Yep.
which is a run rate of 1 million robots from Tesla. There may be others that are competitive, but
Right.
it's important just to look at this in simple order of magnitudes and go, if he does build a factory in 27 that does 10 million, then you've got a large enough production on an annual basis from one or more vendors, 10, 20 million a year. I mean, think of it like automobiles, that there is a self-sustaining, place for it to go, vet it out, look at the TAM, figure out the applications, go through the teething pains over the next 2 years. And, then that also makes doing a discounted cash flow and a forecast of the stock price a lot easier, because you can just basically work your way back and go, if he delivers on, he has that 1 million robots in operation, as one of the terms, but if he can build a factory that generates 10 million robots a year by 27, that's assured. We're done, and we're starting down being able to model how that comes out to the higher EBITDAs over time. Because I
Right.
think, most people are discussing 80-90% of company value will be from the robots.
Yeah, I hear you. I mean, that the reason I asked you the question is because I'm also, and I personally don't have an answer. If you look at the current development, and people can debate it, but I think there isn't a huge gap right now between the Chinese development on humanoid robots and the Tesla development, other than maybe the chips inside. But what I'm wondering is there a conceivable way that maybe a simpler than Optimus robot would ever be allowed in the US?
I'm not sure that discussing, I see you're German, because you talk in terms of what is permissible, and none of this is preventable.
Yes,
So
I
the
agree.
idea of any nation saying either, oh, we're going to prevent you from having ASI, we're going to prevent you from building humanoid robots, we're going to prevent the singularity from coming because we say so, because we object to it on reasons X,
Right,
right? The vast majority of those are human, sociologically, and anthropologically driven.
right.
So this is why, Elon's going, Larry Page called me a speciesist. And the subtext here, and maybe this is a good area to sort of close up on, is I'm very much working on singularity preparedness. And a huge portion of this is to get people to understand that they can't vote this away. They can't just, protest what is coming, and that this is, in my opinion, and some others, the evolution of biologic intelligent life into synthetic life. So, you could just as easily prevent it from happening as, the sun not shining, which is what's powering the whole thing in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
So maybe we can then, for the last few minutes, just venture into, in your vision, and you said let's not go much further than 27 or 28. Let's say, end of 28 or so. How will life for today's investor, whether it's a Tesla investor or real estate investor, or maybe both, what do you think how life will look different than what we're used to today?
well, it depends if you're keeping the context in Tesla investor, and
Mhm.
then you say, Elon's a Tesla investor. Hey,
Right.
Elon, by the end of 28, what metrics have you met? So I'll just defer for a longer conversation there that says that
Right.
that will drive. It might be a $5 trillion company, might be four, there's, from a
Yeah,
purely
but
financial
yeah,
perspective, it's, who knows?
no, I hear you. I meant more really in the literal sense, life. Will we have, will AI be gone to AGI or maybe even ASI on the door? Will investing look very different, or will it look, similar, but we know it's changing? What do you think?
Well, I'll keep to the things I know a little about, which is more along the A-line lines. The conventional wisdom is that by the end of 27, ASI is here.
Okay.
And there are many who believe that functional AGI, myself included, has been here for a long time, because one of the challenges with functional AGI is it glorifies human stupidity, and how really stupid you can be and still survive and still do your job and still be considered intelligent, right? So there's a huge difference between a machine that ultimately you can teach it, hey, this is the optimal solution for any problem set. And Andrew Gross, Wisner Gross, talks about how, we are on the edge of AI solving mathematics. And if it solves mathematics, it's unlocked the matrix, physics, biology, everything will fall in the next 5 years or so, because we are right now at the cusp of solving the fundamental rules of this simulation, aka the universe, right? Which is the mission statement of XAI, know this universe, right? So from there, that's also where pouring all of these AI technologies and building that out is where you continue to raise the planetary intelligence and unlock all the secrets. That's the theory. So, you know, this is a wonderful time to be alive because it looks like everything Kurzweil and Diamandis and Seba and others have been discussing. It's like literally the next 18 months. And now the challenge is, how do we as Tesla investors maximize our alpha, but also as individuals, how do we find purpose with this new AI system? How do we integrate with having AI in our daily lives? And how do we ultimately use the knowledge that the singularity is coming to help us personally evolve from biologic humans into synthetic transhumans?
All right, wow, that's a great final statement. Thank you so much, Chris. So if people are now fascinated, as they should be, about all the things and how you think and what you're into, where should they go? Where can they follow you? How could they potentially get in touch?
Sure. Chris at digitalhabitats.global or digitalhabitats.global website. Check it out, and happy to talk to you at any time.
Awesome. Well, then I want to thank you again for making the time today and going a little bit into space with me and back, I think. And I hope that we can do this more often, because I really enjoy to learn about your perspective, and I absolutely love it when somebody brings me a little bit back and say, hey, your German genes are talking here. You know, so,
yeah, especially with the permissive society, right? You know, so
yeah,
this is not the time to ask for permission. This is the time maybe to ask for forgiveness.
Okay, well, we close on that. Thank you again so much, and hope we can do it soon again.
Likewise. Have a great day, Axel.